So, how to transform capitalism? And of course, this is a key question when we speak about zero growth economy or any growth we want to have. First, I will present a small model just to make the problem clear. And then I will speak about socialization of investment, control consumption demand, government and external demand, and then I come to the conclusion. As you can already see with socialization of investment, my presentation is very much based on Keynes' idea and actually also Schumpeter's idea. So when you look what Schumpeter and Keynes wrote about the future of capitalism, the transformation of capitalism, you come to very interesting results you do not expect first. So, I mean, Keynes' basic question was, how can I plan GDP that we have full employment? That, I think, that was his key question, because he thought the market mechanism as such would not lead to a GDP growth that would fulfill full employment. And I think this idea can be transferred to the debate of growth, degrowth, etc. So let's say Peter and Martin tell me or tell us we need, given a certain technological change, we need this and this GDP to have a sustainable situation. Then we can use basically Keynes and Schumpeter's idea to plan, so to speak, politically plan a certain GDP growth. And what is needed, I think it's obvious that in the existing capitalist system, such a kind of politically determined GDP growth is very difficult to achieve. So let's look at this very small model, and to make clear what the problem is. So very simple, everybody knows GDP is gross investment plus consumption demand plus government demand. Here we have our investment function, which of course has nothing to do with the reality. Investment passively adjusts to the other demand elements. Alpha, this is the capital coefficient. So investment simply endogenously adjusts. We have a very typical consumption function. G is government expenditure. This is disposable income, marginal propensity to consume. If we put in 2 and 3 and 1, we get 4. And GDP is dependent on government expenditure, consumption function, and investment adjusts endogenously to the demand needed. Or you see this very simple model. So if output increases, investment, gross investment increases endogenously, and we find a certain equilibrium. So this kind of model, of course, has nothing to do with a capitalist economy. So when we have this kind of investment functions, that investment is adjusting to other demand elements or to general demand, I think this is just the opposite what Schumpeter, Keynes, or even Marx would have argued, because these economists argued investment is the most volatile demand element. Investment is in a very violent way determining general GDP development along the business cycle, etc. So this of course, convinced Keynes that socialization of investment is needed to transform capitalism in a more stable system. Also, Keynes argued we need to control income distribution to control consumption demand. So also consumption demand has to be controlled. So my general message is, if we want to have a zero growth economy or degrowth or certain GDP growth, 1% or whatever, in a stable, sustainable way, investment has to be controlled, consumption has to be controlled, and government has to be controlled. And all three macroeconomic demand elements must fit together in a coherent way. So it's not a planned economy, but it's very heavy interventions are needed on a macroeconomic level to control these different demand elements. Let's come to investment. And what did Keynes recommend? Okay, I just a few quotes. I suggest that progress lies in the growth and in the recognition of semi-autonomous bodies within the state, bodies which in the ordinary course of affairs are mainly autonomous within their prescribed limitations, but are subject in the last resort to the sovereignty of democratic expressed through parliament, democracy expressed through parliament. And Keynes mentions here ports, railways, companies, universities, etc. And it's clear he thought a kind of big government sector, including ports, railways, and universities, would be one of the key elements to stabilize investment demand, to socialize investment demand. But then I found very astonishing arguments by Keynes and Schumpeter, so I read you two quotes. But more interesting than this is a trend of joint stock institutions. One of the most interesting and unnoticed development of recent decades has been the tendency of enterprises to socialize itself. A point arrives in the growth of big institutions at which the owners of capital, its shareholders, are almost entirely disassociated from the management. Or Schumpeter, the perfectly bureaucratized giant industrial unit not only ousts the small and medium-sized firms and expropriates its owners, but in the end it also ousts its entrepreneur and expropriates the bourgeoisie as a class, which in the process stands lose not only its income, but also once it's infinitely more important, its function. It loses its functions. And I think this is a very important point for Schumpeter and also for Keynes, because they believed the shareholders are not necessary any longer. Important is management, and one can substitute, so to speak, ownership by other mechanisms to control stock companies. This brings me to my key idea, not explicitly developed by Keynes and Schumpeter, but you could argue they more or less followed this idea. What is a key element to control investment is a credit plan. A credit plan which fixes the volume of credit which is allowed to be given. And basically, we have three groups of enterprises, and the credit is allocated to these different groups. First, we have the public sector, ports, universities, so to speak. Then we have stakeholder stock companies in the extreme version of the future, so to speak. All private ownership disappears in this stock holdings, stock companies. We could have government holdings, development banks, employees, local communities as owners. And then we have a big sector of private enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises. They get a certain volume of credit. This is allocated by banks. You may think that that's a very unrealistic utopian type of model, but actually when you look at Japan in the 50s, or when you look at the Southeast Asian miracle countries, or when you look at many decades in China, even today, to a certain extent, you find exactly this model. You find this credit plan. Let's take Japan. In Japan, for example, 50% in the 50s, Stiglitz writes, 50% of the credit volume was politically decided in the 50s and 60s in Japan. The rest was decided by the banks. There was credit rationing. The central bank set a ceiling, and that's it. The bank allocated the volume of credit given. So one could closely analyze how in early Japan, in the Southeast Asian countries, or in China, such a model was used. Okay, let's come to the control of consumption. I think it was mentioned several times during this workshop that it might be very necessary to bring down profit rates and also to change income consumption. So let's say if we have zero growth economy, net saving must be zero. I cannot imagine, if you have super rich people with high income, that they will not save. So what to do? Change income distribution. And again, a very radical quote from Keynes: real interest rates should and can become zero. Real interest rates of zero are justified as interest today rewards no genuine sacrifice any more than does the rent of land. There is no justification for an interest rate. We don't have to accumulate. We don't have to give incentives for people to save. This is his idea. And one could imagine a credit plan, again, Japan to China, a credit plan, and the central bank fixes the refinancing rate at a very low level, or even fixes the lending rate of banks. And when you look at South Korea or so, real interest rates were slightly positive over decades, and people were happy with that. If you have a very low interest rate, this of course also will bring down the minimum profit rate, what would be a positive contribution to income distribution in general. And when you follow this model I developed here, anyway, the profits from stock companies would not flow to the private sector. It would flow to certain public units. In the big area of small and medium-sized enterprises, profits can be made, but here we have a competitive environment, so that profits are not that much important. Tax policy, again, Keynes. Well, there are certain justifications for inequality of incomes which do not apply equally to inheritances. So we could really argue that inheritances violate the merit principle, because it's very unfair if you start your life with a millionaire, or if you have nothing. Atkinson, for example, recommended not long ago that each person can get 100,000 euro as an inheritance, and then a progressive inheritance tax could start. Of course, you could have certain specific regulations for small, medium-sized companies, etc. For the income tax, he recommended 65%. The government sector, I think that also became clear during the workshop. If we have a zero growth economy, the government sector, the budget deficit is zero. And yeah, I think still there might be some room for anti-cyclical fiscal policy, but in general, it is financed by taxes. The external sector is also of special importance, because it's clear if you have such a highly regulated domestic economy, you need something like a Bretton Woods system according to Keynes' idea, with the proposal of a clearing union. So more or less you need a balanced current account. And I think what is also necessary, of course, if you want to have this concept of a credit plan, you need capital controls. Otherwise, you cannot realize this credit plan. By the way, the credit plan in Japan worked until the early 1990s, I think, until 1991. Why did it break down? They deregulated international capital flows, and suddenly firms could go abroad to take credit, etc. The credit plan broke down. So if you have something like control of credits and the control of GDP, you need international capital controls. The labor market, I don't want to say much to the labor market. The main instrument, of course, is adjustment of working time, probably of population, adjustment of working time according to GDP and productivity development. Let's come to the conclusion. I think we should be realistic. A zero growth economy, which implies a politically determined GDP, a medium-term politically determined GDP, it could be zero growth, degrowth, whatever. Such a politically determined GDP is not possible to have it in the existing capitalist system. I think very intensive, comprehensive regulations are needed to come to such a scenario. What are the key elements which are needed? This is really the control of investment as a key element to stabilize the investment dynamic. And I can only imagine that something like a credit plan is necessary for such a control. Also, I think what is very much needed is a change in income distribution to avoid saving of the super rich. And saving anyway is not needed any longer, so we don't need super rich households. And also control of the external sector is necessary. There can be trade, but there cannot be a kind of global financial system we have now. This vision is not a planned economy. A big private sector is existing. We have even competition between state-owned socialized stock companies, and the price mechanism still is in place. So it's not a planned economy, it's a kind of heavily regulated macroeconomic framework, if you like. And this vision is, of course, an utopia, but I think it's possible if the political will is existing. And my last sentence, I think if such a system cannot be implemented in one version or the other, the existing capitalist system will not be able to solve the ecological crisis. So it might be very useful to start debates when it becomes clear that the existing system is not able to solve the problem, to start debates how a system could be look like, which really implies a fundamental reform of the existing capitalism. Thank you very much so far. I hope we have enough controversies to debate. Thank you.